Thanks a lot for inviting me here to present in this round. So I'm not part of consulting. So I'm actually part of product management based out of Waldorf. So product management for the integration suite, right? I also cover SAP Process Orchestration, SAP Process Integration, and also application interface framework within product management. And today I would like to give an introduction into the pipeline concept. Or actually, I don't talk about pipeline concept anymore nowadays. I talk about pipeline for cloud integration because it has become a solution, and rather than the concept, right? So originally we planned to have a concept that you can then provide this as a package and that you can copy the package and adapt to your needs. But we have introduced or put in so much effort already and new features and custom exit so that this really has become a solution. This was a joint effort actually together with the consulting organization, right? The SAP consulting organization, and also involving the customer, the COE, the Center of Excellence experts who actually take care of the larger customers with the max attention contract, right? And we also have involved a couple of customers to collect feedback at a very early stage, right? So the agenda would be roughly give an overview and the motivation, why we came up with this pipeline concept. Then I will go quickly through the sequence of flows for better understanding what is it all about, and also talking a bit about how to monitor and operate messages that use the pipeline. And then also look into a quite new feature that we've recently shipped, where we have introduced or incorporated the pipeline approach in the migration tool, right? And I also planning to show 2 demos if time permits. On the intro motivation, a bit too busy this slide here, sorry for this. So the motivation, actually there are 2 parts of motivating the pipeline concept, more or less. One part, if you look into how the message processing is done in process integration, process orchestration, and this is actually done in so-called pipelines, right? Static pipelines. And where the order of the pipeline steps is given, and then you have a pipeline step to determine the receivers, determine the interfaces, running the mapping, and so on. And the advantage of this static pipeline is that processing qualities like exactly ones in order, exactly ones in order, or restart capabilities, error handling, this comes all out of the box, right? In cloud integration, as part of Integration Suite, we are very flexible in modeling our integration flows, right? Much more flexible compared to the static pipeline. So you have the full flexibility, but the disadvantage is that exactly once delivery, error handling, restart capabilities actually needs to be modeled individually, right, or manually. So for each flow that you build, you need to model your error handling or restart capabilities. And this one is one of the motivations that we come up with a solution where all those processing qualities also come out of the box, like you used to have it on PIPO. The other motivation is that resources on cloud integration are limited. I mean, they are also limited on PIPO, but PIPO is handled by you, administrated by you, and then you can add more resources if required, right? In the cloud, since this is a shared environment, it's sometimes not so easy, especially when it comes to JMS resources, right? So there is a limitation of 30 JMS queues, which can then be increased to 100 by self-service very easily. But then above this, you need to open an incident ticket, and you also need to then provide a reason why you would need more than 100 JMS queues, right? And this is another motivation why we came up with this pipeline concept, to actually process all your async messages, but and on the other side, reducing the resources required. Right? And with the pipeline concept, with pipeline cloud integration, and this is all addressed, right? So decoupling of your message processing, exactly once delivery, or sophisticated restart capabilities, either manually or automatic restart capabilities with a maximum number of restart that you can define, a dead letter queue where messages are then moved if the maximum retry has been exceeded. It also simplifies the operations to some extent by having the different pipelines, and then if an error happens, you know exactly, you can actually isolate or know exactly which pipeline or which step within your message processing the error happens, whether it's during the receiver determination, during the mapping, or during the inbound conversion, right? And as said, it also lowers the number of JMS queues to actually a minimum, right? If you take the fully decoupled pipeline, which I will cover in a minute, you end up with 4 JMS queues. Taking into account also the dead letter queues, you end up with 8 queues, right? You only need 8 queues to process all your messages asynchronously on cloud integration. If you use the integrated messaging runtime, which we then have introduced at a later point of time, you even only need half of the number of queues, right? But you will see this in a minute, right? And it also simplifies the integration flow modeling, right? Because most of the integration flows that you model on your own, or which you would then generate using the migration tool, are more or less point-to-point patterns, right? Not complicated, not complicated flows with wildcards, router, and so on. So, and all the logic actually is built into generic, so-called generic flows that we actually provide. Yeah. And so this is how the pipeline looks like. So you see the blue boxes, those are the queues, right? This is now the fully decoupled pipeline. Recommendation is actually use the integrated messaging runtime, which I will show in a minute, but I think it's easier to explain the pipeline concept using this first pipeline that we have introduced, right? When we introduce this concept. And you see the blue ones are the queues where the messages are stored. And then the integration flows, here for the integration flow, we distinguish between generic integration flows that we ship, and then scenario-specific integration flows that you need to create based on your scenario. And then what you can also see on this slide is that we actually use the partner directory, and we use a partner directory to dynamically configure then the overall message processing, message flow for the particular scenarios, right? And in the generic flows, then the partner directory is actually read to determine the path or which mapping is used, or to actually run the XPath conditions to determine the receiver, right? And with this, you are able to reduce the number of JMS queues to a minimum, right? And we are able to actually provide error handling, restart capabilities within a generic flow, so that you don't need to build them redundantly, right? It's already built in. And as said, the only flows that you build are more or less point-to-point flows, right? Like the inbound flow. So if a message comes in, then you have a scenario-specific inbound flow. And here, more or less, the sender adapter is scenario-specific, right? And then once the message comes in, you directly put this into the first queue, the inbound queue, and from there you then pick up the message. And the next step is that you do an inbound conversion if required, right? So this generic inbound flow would now read the partner directory and would check if this specific scenario requires an inbound conversion, like a JSON to XML conversion or CSV to XML conversion or whatever, right? And if this is the case, would run the conversion by calling another scenario-specific flow, right? And then if this was successful, then would write a message to the next queue. That's the second queue. And then in the second generic flow, which does the receiver determination, message would be read from the second queue. Then an XSLT would be read from the partner directory. So we run actually an XSLT mapping to determine the receivers. So we have all our XPath conditions then built into the XSLT. And then this XSLT would result into a list of receivers. We split up the list of receivers, and for each receiver, we would then write a message into the third queue, where we do actually then the interface determination, right? Similar concept. We use an XSLT to determine the different interfaces. It might be that for one receiver, we would then actually split up to 2 or more interfaces. And then we do actually more or less the same approach, read in an XSLT from the partner directory, run the XSLT, splitting up the interfaces, and then sending the messages to the last queue, right? And then the last flow, the generic flow, the outbound generic outbound flow is just then handling the restart of messages if the next flow fails, and passing then the message to the right outbound flow, to the right scenario-specific outbound flow, right? Where we run through a mapping, if a mapping is required, or outbound conversion, and then have with a receiver adapter passing a message to the receiver. Right. That's how actually the partner looks like. And the blue one, that's what we actually ship, right? Nowadays, we do have 3 different pipelines. As I said, we have started with the fully decoupled pipeline, and then we did some improvements, building a so-called integrated messaging runtime for asynchronous message processing. And we also have put in a synchronous integrated messaging runtime if you have content-based router scenarios, right? Where based on an XPath, you pass it to one receiver or the other, but in a synchronous mode, right? Synchronous fashion. And that's how the integrated messaging pipeline looks like. So we figured that we could actually improve the overall pipeline in terms of performance by combining the inbound conversion and the receiver and interface determination in one single pipeline step, right? The so-called integrated messaging async. And by doing this, we end up with only 2 queues, right? So the message comes in, is written into this inbound queue, and then this integrated messaging async pipeline reads the message, would check if there is an inbound conversion required, would read one XSLT and combine XSLT, where we do both receiver determination and interface determination, and then split up the result of this mapping, and then send the messages to the last queue, right? And then the rest would be the same like for the fully decoupled. And this is much better in terms of performance and also in terms of resource handling, because we only need 2 JMS queues. And we have seen in performance measurements that actually accessing JMS queue and accessing the XSLT mapping from partner directory takes up the most CPU, right? And so we reduce then the number of JMS queue, and we reduce the number of XSLTs. Right. And the other pipeline is the synchronous. Is that if you have synchronous content-based routing scenarios, and here you don't need any JMS queue because for sync, right, there's no decoupling required. And here you have an inbound scenario-specific inbound flow, and then you fetch an XSLT where you carry out the receiver and interface determination, and then you call the one receiver, which would then return the response, and then you pass back the response to the original sender. Then there are also some special cases which we have built in, like for XI inbound and IDOC inbound. So we have actually built a generic XI inbound and generic IDOC inbound, so that you only have a single point of entry for all your XI inbound scenarios and all your IDOC inbound scenarios, right? Which then also reduces the effort, the configuration effort on the sender system. There is a possibility, if you come from PIPO and you have probably used the so-called extended receiver determination, right, where you run a mapping to determine the receivers, that you reuse this extended receiver determination instead of the XSLT. There is also an option that you use receiver-specific JMS queues, right? You could also then use one receiver-specific queues or a group of one queue for a group of receivers, right? And then there are also options to bypass steps if required, like point-to-point, right? If you have a pure point-to-point scenario, then you can actually bypass most of the steps. You could also bypass the interface determination or bypass receiver determination. Right? And next, I would show you how the flow look like, right? The sequence of flows. This is an example of the very first flow, right? The scenario-specific flow. You shouldn't build in any logic other than setting the sub SAP headers, right? So to reduce the probability of failures, right? So once the message comes in, you set the SAP header, and actually you need to set the subsender and subsender interface headers with the name of the sending system and the name of the sender interface. And this is then actually used in the generic flows to determine your scenario, right? And once you have done this, you directly store the message to the first queue, and then the cloud, the cloud integration runtime guarantees delivery, right? Because the message is stored in the cloud integration. Very similar to how we do this in process integration, process orchestration. Right? Then the second flow, this is the first generic flow, generic inbound processing. This would then read the partner directory and would check if for this specific scenario we need to do an inbound conversion. And if this is the case, it would call the third flow via process direct, right? And the response would then be passed to the JMS queue or stored in the second JMS queue. And if there is no conversion needed, it would directly store this in the JMS queue, right? Then this is an example where we do a conversion, right? This step number 3 with a scenario-specific inbound conversion. In this case, would be JSON to XML converter. Then number 4 would be the generic receiver determination. This was one of the first active versions of the pipeline steps. In the meantime, it looks a bit differently, right? Because we have built some much more features in, right? So actually the screenshots, they haven't been updated. Otherwise, to explain the pipeline concept, I think the old screenshots are much better because the new ones I wouldn't be able to fit into the slides here, right? Anyway, the default path is quite simple. You read the message from the second JMS queue. You read an XSLT mapping from the partner directory, you carry out the XLD mapping, and then you split up into the number of receivers which have been determined, fetch the payload again, and then send this to the next queue, right? And here you can see how such an XLT looks like, right? Then you can see that we have potentially 3 receivers, and we have the XPath based on the category or product name, and then we also need to specify in this receiver not determined node what the runtime should do if no receiver could be determined. In this case, raise an error. So we actually support the same options like in PIPO, so would be raising an error. And ignoring would simply end the processing without error, or send a message to a default receiver, right? And if we carry out this XLT, the result may look like this. In this case, we have determined 2 receivers, to receiver 1 and 2, and this message would then be split up, right, into 2 messages. And then we fetch a payload, and then for receiver 1 and for receiver 2, we would then store messages in the next queue, right? In this case, we would then store 2 messages in the next queue. Then we pick up the message from this queue, run through the generic interface determination, exactly similar approach, fetching the XLT, running through the XLT, determine the interfaces, split up the interfaces. And here we have an example how this looks like. Here again, we have XPath conditions, and depending on whether they apply or not, we would then add those interface nodes. And here you would actually see then the endpoint of the very last scenario-specific outbound flow, right? And this we actually then pass to the last generic flow, so that the last generic flow dispatches the messages to the right integration flow, right? And here we have an example of the outcome of this XLT mapping. In this case, we would now determine 2 interfaces, right? So the message is then split up into 2 messages and sent to 2 different integration flows, right? And the last generic flow, this outbound processing, doesn't do much. It's simply there to dispatch the message to the last flow, right? To this outbound processing flow, the scenario-specific outbound processing flow, and it handles the restart capability in case that the message fails, right? And in the last flow, that's where you do the most of your logic, right? That's where you do the mappings, where potentially the probability that the message fails is the highest compared to all the other steps, right? So usually then if your message fails, it fails in the mapping. You could then also put in here an outbound conversion like XML to JSON conversion, right? And then pass the message actually to the receiver, right? So how do we monitor and operate this? Now, since we now process the whole message not only in one single integration flow, but in different integration flows, right? The monitoring becomes more sophisticated, right? I mean, we end up with much more logs, and so we have introduced some mitigations, right, to be able to actually then better monitor this pipeline. And one feature is that we use the custom status heavily in the pipeline concept. Like, for instance, if a scenario-specific flow, which we call via Pros Direct, fails, it remains it fails because restart is done from the generic flow to call that flow, right? And so in monitoring, you might now think that, oh, you need to fix this. This is a failed message. But actually, you can ignore this because restart is done from the generic flow. And to indicate that this can be ignored, we set the custom status to retry by a parent flow, right? Or another example is if the maximum number of retries have been exceeded, right? In this example, actually, we set this to completed and set the maximum retries to exceeded. But this, as I said, this is an old screenshot. Nowadays, we set the status actually to escalated, but it's also customized. You can also customize it, right? You can decide whether you put this on completed or escalated. By default, we now put this on escalated, right? And then you can see in the max retries in the status that the maximum retries have been exceeded, and then this message has been actually moved to that letter queue. If you go to the attachments, we have added additional information where you can read that it has been moved from the one queue to the other one. And if you then like to reprocess this, then you can move from the step letter queue back to the original queue, right, where it would then be reprocessed again. Yeah. And it's possible that you correlate all messages, right? As said, we have much more logs now. And if you like to know which logs belong to the same message, right? And then you can filter for this correlation. I will shortly show you a demo because we have done some improvements here in the monitor. So then it's easier to actually correlate the messages. This brings me to an idea that in the background, I will just quickly create a couple of example messages so that I can better monitor you. So that's done on my second screen. Next, there is a possibility that you can actually implement your own custom error handling, right? So the standard error handling that we have introduced does a restart, and by default, it does a maximum number of 5 restarts, and if 5 has been exceeded, it writes a message into the data queue. You can customize this, so you can actually then define a lower or higher number of maximum retries per scenario that you actually maintain in the partner directory, or you can actually create your own integration flow that you call instead of calling the standard error handling, right? And then you can implement your own error handling or restart capabilities in your own flow. So that's an option. Further on, for IDOCs, you would then also find all the IDOC numbers in the custom headers, right? If we have IDOC bulks, you would then see all IDOCs here in the custom headers. You can search for specific IDOCs. And in the newer version, actually, we have removed the leading zeros, right? So that it's easier than to search for IDOCs. And we also have a concept by adding custom header properties, right? Then you can pass a header to the generic flows with the value and with the ID and the value, or the name and the value, or a name value key pair for the custom headers. And then you can actually add custom headers to all your flows and search for specific headers. Right. Yeah, this is the partner director user interface, right? That's where you actually maintain your scenarios. And here you use binary parameters to upload the XSLTs to determine your receivers or your interfaces. In string parameters, you need to maintain, for instance, the endpoint of the inbound conversion or the next retry. And in the alternative partners, that's where you actually map sender and the sender interface to your scenario. I can also show you in a minute. Right. And what we also have recently introduced is support for different stages, right? Whether you like to run this on production, QA, or dev. Actually, here you're flexible to define your stages. You can also define 4 or 5 stages, also having a sandbox or whatever. So here you're quite flexible, right? So the approach would be that you define a partner with exactly this name, SAP Integration Suite landscape, and there you map the tenant host name to a stage ID, right? Like PRD or QA. And then in your business system, right, you map then the actual business system name to an alias system name, right? So within pipeline, we work with alias. In this case, the BSDD2 would be an alias, and the actual business name would be BSDD2_Q, right? And then it would automatically detect the stage that the message is processed. With the stage, it would then determine the alias, right? And then the XSLT only uses alias, right? The advantage is that you don't need to change the XSLT if you transport or import the XSLT between dev, QA, and prod, right? The XSLT is always the same because it works with alias, right? But it's actually not mandatory to use the staging, right? In most cases, you don't need a staging. I mean, you actually only need this if you have XI and IDOC scenarios, right? Because here we work with real business names, and then on different stages, we have different business system names, right? If you have a file adapter scenario, for instance, pulling from a file, then you don't need those stages, right? And you actually have both options, either use stages or not. Right? Good. With that, I would like to quickly show you how such a scenario look like. Just refreshing. So you can see that here in the partner directory, I would like to show you the partner directory. Here we go, right, in this monitoring. So monitoring integration APIs, you find this partner directory tile. And I follow the specific naming conventions. All my systems, they start with BS for business systems. All my scenarios, they start with CS for configuration scenarios. And we have, for instance, this scenario. You can actually see that I have customized the maximum number of retries to 2. As said, default is 5. I have defined the inbound queue as pipx01. This points actually to the integrated messaging runtime. And I also have defined an inbound conversion endpoint, right? And where we do, I think this stuff is doing the filtering, right? On a binary, you see we only have one single XSLT. So we have this combined XSLT where we do receiver and interface determination in one. And I can quickly download this and show you how this looks like. You see here that we have this list of receivers, right? Receiver not determined is default. And in this case, we need to specify a default receiver, which is this ERP21. And then for this specific, we also have interface determinations, right? So you see that actually, if I just close this receiver not determined, you see then here, this is then the first XPath condition for the first receiver. And then for this receiver, we would have 2 XPath conditions to determine the interfaces, right? And that's how actually this combined XLD looks like, right? You can also use, not in this case, but you can also use headers or properties, and which you define then on top of the XLT, and then in the XPath you can also use then headers and properties. Right. And on the alternative partners, then you can see that here I have mapped the business system, right? As scheme, I used the interface name and the namespace. So this is a specific case because this is an XI inbound case where I have the possibility to also use namespace to map this to the scenario, right? And if the message comes in with a specific business system, in this case, actually BSDD2, BSDDQ2, right, would be the real business name, right? And then in the generic inbound flow, I would then map this to my alias name, to this one, right? And then in here in this alternative partners with this alias name and this service name, this sender interface name and the namespace, I would then find out this scenario, right? So monitoring, quickly show you the monitoring. I nowadays use this message status overview, which we have recently introduced, and then I sort by senders, right? And you can see I have actually sent 3 messages, 3 sample messages, based on for two senders. And if I go here, and then you would see the different messages, and that's new now that you can see here. There now we have a link for the collation ID, right? I think this has been introduced in the last tenant update, right? You can either copy this and then paste here, or directly click on this correlation ID, and then it filters for this correlation. And then you would see for this specific message, you actually find 5 logs, right, for the XI inbound. And here you can also then see that we have introduced, that we have added the information about what is the sender. And here we don't use the alias name, we use the real sender name. And we also, for XI inbound, we have set the quality of service, right? So that you can see it's in exactly one scenario. And we also added to the custom headers the alias name, right? So that you can also see, this scenario is actually this alias name, right? And in the outbound, then we would also see here the receiver, right? In this case, we also have a real receiver name, right? And then we would actually also see both alias, right? Good. Then I think I need to rush a bit. So I also like to show you the pipeline approach in the migration tool. So if you migrate from Process Integrated Process Orchestration, and actually pipeline concept helps you to facilitate your own migration, right? Because your scenarios then can actually reuse a lot of objects from PIPO, and it also follows, this pipeline concept follows similar concept, right? But actually you can also use this pipeline concept if you start from scratch, right? You don't have to necessarily come from PIPO. You can also, it also makes sense to use the pipeline concept for any kind of async communication, right? For the migration, here we have a tool inbuilt into the designer, right? You might have seen this already. And I just like to point to this recent innovation, which is that we now also support a pipeline approach, right? And instead of going through the slides, I would rather like to then show you how this looks like. So let's go here into design, right? I have the package, right? Usually you need a package, switch to the artifacts tab, and then if you switch to edit mode, then you find this migrate button, right? This would then trigger the migration wizard. First step, you need to connect to a process integration or process orchestration system, right? Next step, you need to select an integration scenario. If you connect to a dual stack, you can also choose integration scenarios based on receiver determination, but I'm not on a dual stack, so I only ICOs supported those integrated configuration objects, right? And then I can filter for a specific scenario. I think I take this one next. So this is actually a content-based router scenario where based on the XPath, we route this to different receivers. Then this here, the pattern is determined, but we can't really tell whether it's content-based or recipient-based, right? Difference is content-based, based on the XPath, it's routed to exactly one receiver. In recipient list, it might be routed to multiple receiver, right? Like a multicast where we don't have any conditions, or it simply is routed to multiples. If you choose the pipeline concept, actually doesn't matter because the pipeline concept doesn't distinguish between content-based routing and recipient list. If you choose standard, it matters because then the model looks a bit differently, right? But we actually would like to create or generate objects supporting the pipeline concept. So we select the pipelines, we go next. Then we can specify that we would like to reuse a mapping which exists in this very package. Next, then we get a confirmation which objects are reused, right? Next, and that's where we need to specify now a scenario name, right? We can use demo expert session, right? And depending on what scenario name you specify here, then below the endpoints are updated accordingly. And then you can see here actually then the information, which is the sender component, which is sender interface, which is read from the ICO. In the next update of the tenant, you are also able to override this, right? That you can actually change the name we mentioned here. We need to specify to which pipeline should the message be sent. By default, we recommend you use the integrated messaging runtime. We can see the endpoint of the inbound conversion because it has determined that or identified that this ICO actually uses an inbound conversion. You can also override this. And here we see the XPath conditions, right? And intentionally, we put this XPath condition as editable, just in case that they haven't been properly defined here, right? And then you can also adapt this here at this point of time already. And from this information, then actually the XSLT would be then created, right? And now we can click on migrate, and now it would actually automatically create the objects. You can see here now it creates 5 different integration flow, the scenario specific inbound, the inbound conversion, and for each receiver 1 integration flow. We can then also here on the partner directory see that a partner has been created, and the next step it would then explain you what are the next steps. I think for pipeline, for instance, it would tell you that you need to, as a prerequisite, you need to actually deploy the generic flows, right? And from here, we could also then navigate and to the generated party. Where is it? Here we go. Then you can see here this string parameter has been updated automatically. The alternative partner has been added to determine this partner for this scenario. And also you can see here, this is this receiver determination, right? Download, which has been actually automatically created. Good, with this, I'm almost done. I'd like to point you to this GitHub repository. So if you like to play around or get familiar with the pipeline concept, play around with the pipeline concept, actually we have created a couple of sample scenarios, all covering a different aspect of the pipeline concept. And it comes also with a Postman collection so that you can also create automatically the partner directory entries, can install scenario specific or deploy the scenario specific flows, and then send some example messages, right? And you can also use this as a template to learn more how actually the pipeline concept can be configured. And by the way, you can find this information on the SAP Integration Suite topic page, right? If you scroll down, there is a transition to the cloud section. That's here a blog where I introduced the pipeline.